Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about how Russia failed to modernize effectively by the time World War I rolled around as compared to the United States and Germany, who were big powerhouses in the World War I era. So, first, we need some background. So, what was America doing in the 19th century? Okay, so at the beginning of the 19th century, 1803, we bought land from France that was bought so we could fulfill Manifest Destiny, and it was 827,000 square miles. It was west of the colonies, and we bought it from France. And of course, you've heard about Lewis and Clark. They explored it, met friends. You know the deal. And then lots of people moved west to pursue land opportunities and freedom, fulfilling that destiny. And then we also annexed Texas. And then to expand more on like the annexation of Texas, after the Alamo, Polk also wants California and Mexico, and he refuses to sell it. So the Mexican-American War occurs, and this was the first war fought on foreign soil because the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, all those were fought on the colonies or like Union territory. And we won the war, well, like in quotation marks, and because the leader of Mexico signs away Texas officially, and also he signs away California for $15 million, and our manifest destiny is achieved, and that is when America really, really starts to get imperial. So really great time, and of course, we know and love Texas, love it. And then for the labor and economy in the 19th century, between 1800 and 1860, the percentage of laborers working in the agricultural pursuits in the North dropped drastically from 70% to only 40%. And slavery had died out in the North, and it was replaced by cities and factories by the immigrant labor. And in fact, the majority of immigrants, 7 out of every 8, to be precise, settled into the North rather than the South. And that's because the South had soil that was more fertile. And so there's obviously going to be more agriculture industries because more like the environment's willing to cooperate with like jobs, the more you're going to want to work there. And agriculture was so profitable that there was barely any need for industrial development. And so in the 1860s, when we started to make like great strides in development, the agriculture industry began to decline while manufacturing in the North boomed. And we had a civil war, very fun. We had it because Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election, and the South was scared they were going to take away the free slave labor, and they were like, no, we want to keep exploiting people. So then they decided to secede. 7 states did, and Lincoln and the South, they had a little debacle, aka the Civil War, and then we, of course, won it, and slavery was abolished. And that led to a very big decline in like agriculture in the South, as was previously mentioned, because apparently slave workers don't want to pay people for the profit that they get. So I know, right? And then in the 1850s, we saw the growth of the railroad industry, the Transcontinental Railroad to be exact, and that was 32,000 miles of railroads in the U.S. And speaking of immigration, all over the world, problems hurting the working class, such as crop failure, famine, job shortages, and high taxes, made families immigrate to America. And between 1870 and 1900, 12 million immigrants came to the United States. Most of them were from Europe, but as I mentioned earlier, several immigrants from China came to the U.S. at the start of the gold rush in 1849, and they got those jobs I was talking about. But in 1882, the federal government stopped the immigration from China. And why did they do that? Because the government is racist, but we already knew that. The deeper reasoning and the more complex reasoning is that due to the rapid increase of immigrants from Europe, pretty much all white people needed jobs and started competing for the jobs that Chinese immigrants wanted/had. And the government, of course, wanted to help the white people and ban Chinese immigrants from taking American jobs. I know, right? And the Chinese Exclusion Act pretty much ended immigration from China from nearly a century. And while many immigrants from the East and West Coast did settle near the ports, many did find their way inland to make a life in agriculture. And because the immigrants were so desperate for work, employees took advantage of them and they were paid really bad rates for some of the worst working conditions that we've seen. And it was really terrible. And I included this picture from Pawn Stars. It's Pawn Stars guy, because a lot of when immigrants were coming into America, they could come up with a more American sounding name. Basically, that meant a name that wasn't as hard to pronounce. So here we have Jankowski, and then they were like, oh, we turned into Johnson. So, which is my last name. And then also, I included this picture because a lot of people from Ellis Island came in there sick or with diseases because, of course, disease did rid Europe a lot. But also on the boats that they were on, the conditions were terrible because they were all bunched up together. And it was terrible. And then what was Germany doing? Germany had Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia, which was a German kingdom state, and he used realpolitik, the idea that politics or diplomacy should be based primarily on considerations of the given circumstances and factors rather than ideological notions or moral or ethical premises, which is not a very good thing, but he really wants all the Germanic kingdom states to unite, and spoiler alert, he succeeds. So in that time where Otto von Bismarck is chancellor, he has a couple wars, such as the 7 Weeks' War, that concluded with the North German Confederation and the end of Austria's influence in Germanic states, which was a big problem at the time. And the North German Confederation was the unification of some kingdom states in Germany. And after the 1866 war, a new unified Prussia/Germany, I guess you could call it, wanted to expand the border south, but France was standing in that way. And they knew that France would defend the territory no matter what. And before 1871, Germany was not really a country. It was Germanic kingdom states, as I was talking about. And there is Kanye West, Megan Thee Stallion, and DaBaby. Reports show that they were at the Franco-Prussian diplomatic conference. So wanted to include a picture of that. And in the end, the Franco-Prussian War set the foundation for World War I because it showed France's steady decline as a world power, and Germany and Italy unifying with the territories that they had in the States to become a strong world power. And Bismarck is a boy boss because he had a couple of controversies at the time, such as culture comp, which is basically, it literally means culture struggle. And the Center Party, who was basically represented by the Roman Catholic Church, did not trust Bismarck's Protestant faith and also didn't really care for his policies not that much, but used the faith for a background. And the culture struggle started with Bismarck and dissolved with the Roman Catholic Bureau and the Prussian Ministry of Culture. And also, the working class had growing power and prospects in Germany, and so Bismarck, knowing how powerful they really were, made legislation efforts that would make all the social democratic organizations illegal. And all of Bismarck's accomplishments set the new unified Germany up to be a strong world power and developed a sense of nationalism amongst the German citizens. And a customs union created in 1834 called, I think, Zollverein, is that how you pronounce it? It discontinued the tariff barriers between Prussian states and also created a single external tariff and a single economy for all the states, and played a significant role in unification and nationalism. And of course, Bismarck, gaslight and gatekeep and boy boss.
Now on to the Decembrist Revolt of 1825. Soon after Tsar Alexander I died, about 3,000 Russian soldiers commanded by army officials took part in an unsuccessful protest over Nicholas I now taking the throne, after his older brother Constantine decided to remove himself from the line of succession. Instead of another czar, the revolters wanted a Russian constitution. They were called the Decembrists and were mainly part of the upper class. Alexander II and Emancipation. After peasant revolts, the defeat in the Crimean War, and new public opinions, Alexander II put forth the Emancipation Manifesto of 1861, which freed over 23 million serfs from domestic servitude and house. The 1881 assassination. On March 13, 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by the Executive Committee of Narodная Volia, better known as People's Will, a political organization whose members were set on overthrowing the autocratic system in Russia, mainly by assassinating government officials. Tsar Alexander II was killed in the streets of St. Petersburg by a bomb. Although he did have some good policies like the emancipation of the serfs, he started to change and oppose movements for political reform, which ultimately led to his death. He was succeeded by his son Alexander III. Russification. This was a cultural assimilation movement where non-Russians were expected to turn to Russian culture and language and give up their own. A man named Uvarov introduced the idea in 1770, but it was put into effect by Alexander III, since he believed that all people should become great Russians, and although not physically necessarily, he did believe that all other cultures and ethnicities should be non-existent. Russification under him wasn't really about what type of Russian you were, like Kazakh or Kozak. You just had to be Russian. Alexander III reintroduced this term because, for one, he believed that minorities weakened his country, and two, he wanted Russia to be back in the big leagues. During the second half of the 19th century, Russia was no longer involved in the decisions made over European foreign affairs, so he wanted all of his empire to come together with the same ideas, like one big Russian happy family. This plan didn't really work out for him because the elite in Russia looked up to Germany instead, since they admired its effective rise to leadership. Households and private estates.
Russia ended up in a lot of places after this. Part of the Trans-Siberian Railroad construction was in Manchuria, and Japan did not like that very much. They started building in different sections in Russia because they were trying to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and the Russians were able to obtain permission from China to build a line across Manchuria. But Russia later got nervous about Japan taking over Manchuria and started building a longer, harder route. This railroad was the start of the Russo-Japanese War, and in 1900, Russia sent 170,000 troops into Manchuria, which specifically started the war. Japan became worried that Russia would start expanding throughout East Asia, even as far as Korea, and conflict was born. Japan attacked Port Arthur, where Russian ships were being stationed, and completely triumphed over them. Since the railroad wasn't completed at this time, it was hard for the Russians to transfer supplies and troops. And then after that, it led to the Bloody Sunday protests, and this is where a group of radical workers, led by a local priest named Gapan, stormed to Tsar's Winter's Palace in St. Petersburg and wanted to voice their demands, and were met with imperial troops who opened fire on hundreds of protesters, killing or wounding almost all of them. This resulted in riots and strikes all over the country due to anger over the massacre. This didn't really end up working when Nicholas tried to compromise with the representative meetings towards reform because the radical socialists weren't really willing to change their ideas, and the tension would stretch on for a long period of time, like even up to World War I. And then the October Manifesto was an agreement made due to the 1905 revolution, Bloody Sunday, and it was either this manifesto or a military dictatorship. And this manifesto promised civil liberties like freedom of speech and press, and to form a legislative party like the Duma, where democratic ideals would be used, like members of it being elected by popular vote, and the act of needing permission before legislation was acted upon. The manifesto satisfied enough of the revolution's moderate participants to weaken the anti-government powers and cause the revolution to be suppressed. So we finally get to the real question that is being asked, which is how did Russia fail to modernize effectively by the time World War I rolled around as compared to the United States and Germany? The simple answer is Russia failed. But Rena is going to explain the complexities of why America and Germany were doing better in contrast to Russia's failing internal state.
America and Germany had won each of the wars they fought against, preparing them for warfare in the future. America expanded their borders and kept up a great economy while doing so. Bismarck took advantage of several land grabs and was strategic with the way he made negotiations. Bismarck also used realpolitik as a powerful persuasive technique to appeal to the German citizens. Russia, on the other hand, lost the Russo-Japanese War, which allowed Japan to become a military powerhouse and rise to their imperial status. Russia failed to handle the needs of their citizens, which resulted in protests, which were then met with military brutality. Following up to the previous paragraph, there was almost always civil unrest in Russia during the 19th century, going into the 20th century. No one was ever satisfied to accept what the government was doing, which caused heavy internal conflict in Russia, making them not really focus on the modernization.